Good afternoon, everyone. NASCA's Top 10 virtual series. We'll get started in just a moment. If you're joining us for the first time, please make sure you rename yourself. Give us your name and your state so we know where you're dialing in from. It's great to see so many folks coming in and joining us for today's conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We'll get started here in just a moment. We'll let everyone get logged in, connected to audio. And again, welcome. This is NASCA's Top 10 virtual series. You can go ahead and drop your name and state in chat as well. We'd love to see you all connect with others with us today. This is part of our DEI Professional Forum. So I just really want you to have an opportunity to meet a new colleague and have an opportunity to learn. And I do see several folks still connecting to audio, so we'll give them just a few more seconds and then we'll get started. Great to see so many folks dropping in notes in chat. It's a great way to connect. We want you to make sure you use this for questions together as well. We're going to have an opportunity to hear from all of our speakers today. So if you've got questions, feel free to drop those in there or in the question and answer box, and we'll get to as many as possible today. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome again. This is NASCA's Top 10 virtual series. Every year we put out the top 10 priorities for state chief administrators, really looking at those top activities and challenges and solutions each chief administrator is working on throughout the year. This is our first monthly event, our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Professional Forum. We're excited to have both public and private sector members with us today to represent in their thought leadership. This is a part of a series, as I mentioned. We do both a video podcast series where we have an opportunity to take a deep dive into one state, and then these monthly events where we're doing more of a broad conversation around a topic of our top 10, looking at both the state and private sector as well. So today we're opening with diversity, equity, and inclusion in workforce. We know that diverse teams are much more innovative and they add value to any organization. And research shows that an organization with strong, diverse, with increased job satisfaction, higher levels of trust, and they're more engaged. But it's much more than just diversity. We have to have equity, inclusion, and that sense of belonging. They're all critical to effective teams. And in order to create these teams, we both have to look inwardly at our own perceptions and potential implicit bias, as well as outwardly through the hiring process. And although there are many facets to creating an environment rich with diversity, equity, and inclusion, our time today is only going to allow us to begin the tip of the iceberg with this conversation. And NASCA's professional forum around DEI will continue to explore the various levers critical to success as we move throughout the year. Today, I am thrilled to introduce an expert panel who will share their thought leadership and insights on the topic. We're going to begin today with Sarah O'Rourke and Quaylen Illengrud from McKinsey & Company, who will bring a look at the components of a thriving workplace. Next, we're going to take some time to walk through specific data sets with Bob Oglesby. We're going to have a robust discussion around innovative strategies with specific thoughts from Dr. D'Angelo of the Kansas Department of Administration, and Rebecca Roussel, the Deputy Director of Diversity and Inclusion with the Illinois Department of Central Management Services. And today I'm joined by Ace Callwood, Senior Facilitator with the Envoy Portfolio, who is also an expert with us here today. So let's kick off our conversation today with Sarah and Quaylen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah O'Rourke. I'm a partner at McKinsey & Company and help lead our research on women in the workplace and broader diversity in the workplace in the public sector.
Hello, I'm Quaylen Illengrud, a senior partner, and I lead a lot of our gender equality research and a lot of our work on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Great. And if you go to the next page, Kayla. We're here to talk just briefly about 3 different topics. So one is just a broad overview of the concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Second is a recap of where we are today on diversity and inclusion and what the impact of COVID-19 has been on diversity in the workforce. And then we'll deep dive into how state leaders can improve diversity and equity and inclusion, and specifically focused on unconscious bias, which we see impacting diversity and inclusion across the people pipeline. We hope that you find this research helpful as a foundation for your discussions as state leaders, and we really appreciate your having us today. Before we dive in, just wanted to give some insight in terms of where this research comes from. Every year since 2015, McKinsey has launched a Women in the Workplace survey, which actually looks at the current workplace across public, social, and private sector organizations to see the different experiences and different statistics across gender, race, and other factors. We've had 600 organizations over the last 5 years, representing 22 million people participate. And then more broadly, our research on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which started back in the early 2000s, around how diversity is important to overall organization effectiveness. So if we go to the next page really quickly, what are diversity, equity, inclusion? Why are they important? I think a lot of folks have heard about diversity as an all-encompassing term, but we feel it's pretty important to separate these 3 factors, as they're all really important to have a workplace that's fair and full of opportunity for all people. So diversity is who the workforce represents. It's truly the numbers, the composition or representation of employees across various elements of difference. And as Pam was kind of saying, why we think this is important is we see that more diverse teams are able to solve more complex problems and to drive continuous improvement within organizations. Inclusion is how we make employees feel. Do employees feel embraced? Do they believe they can bring their full selves to work? And we found that that inclusion is really important to maintaining diversity. When people think that they can't bring their full selves to work or don't feel embraced, they leave. And then equity. Equity is ensuring that there's an equal playing field, and it really comes down to norms, practices, and policies to ensure that identity is not a predictor of outcomes in the workplace. Many of you may have seen the image of the 2 people trying to look over the fence at a baseball game, and one person is much taller than the other, and the person who is shorter gets a box to be able to see over the fence. And that's kind of a good visual for how to think about the importance of equity. And it helps instituting policies and programs around improving equity just helps reduce the barriers that come from people facing from different backgrounds. On the next page, we're just outlining a sense of how the public sector is doing overall when it comes to diversity. So here you'll see a pipeline of white men, men of color, white women, and women of color across the different levels of tenure within public sector institutions. What you'll see overall, if you look at the bottom numbers, is that the public and social sector does outperform the private sector in terms of basic representation of women at different levels. And it does also outperform in terms of representation of people of color. However, if you look at, there's a couple things I'd like to point out. One is both in the private sector and in the public and social sector, we see what we call a broken rung. And that is the dip in percentage representation between entry level and manager among women and women of color. And the reason I point this out is because when we talk about diversity, we often say that there is a glass ceiling, implying that the drop-off is mostly at the top leadership levels. Or we say that the biggest drop-off is just not giving people the opportunity to get in the door. What we actually see is that this broken rung has been occurring for several years. And what it points to is the policies, practices, and overall culture or norms of organizations not allowing people of various backgrounds to overcome that first hurdle of promotion. And we'll talk a little bit more about about ways to counter that and what might be driving that. If you go to the next page, what our last Women in the Workplace survey did is look at particularly at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as many of you might already know or expect, it had pretty drastic consequences for 3 groups in particular. 1, mothers; 2, Black women; and 3, senior level women. For mothers, it was the additional burden placed on them by household and childcare duties due to the kind of breakdown of being able to go to daycare and school during the pandemic, with a lot of women starting to say that they're considering leaving the workforce, which could set us back around a decade or half decade in terms of diversity in the workplace. For Black women, it was around a feeling of being the only in the room, which we've found being a very isolating experience, as well as experiencing more deaths and other uncomfortable situations in the course of the pandemic that they were unable to share in the workplace. And for senior level women, it was just sheer burnout, the feeling that they always needed to be on and have feeling consistently exhausted. And so if we go to the next page, as the pandemic brings out the real need and urgency around this topic, we encourage leaders to take a 4-part step in addressing DEI in their organizations. First is understanding the starting point. You need to make sure that you understand truly what the data is telling you about what your particular organization's issues are or your state's issues are when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Is it particular groups that are being targeted? Is your issue the broken rung, or is it at hiring? Do you have pockets of diversity in particular agencies or subdepartments, but others where there's not? And are your practices and policies truly making employees feel included? Get the data. The second is setting a simple and bold aspiration and communicating that across every group, and specifically having that be role modeled by leaders. This is an incredibly important way for people to feel like there's actually going to be change. Third is defining a targeted strategy. Based on what the data is telling you about where the problem is, define the very specific initiatives that will help address that problem. And Quaylen will dive into what unconscious bias is as a problem and some of the solutions we see. And then finally, build on and ensure engagement. So ensure that you're engaging people across the organization, and we'll share some ideas on how you do that to drive your solutions. I'll turn it over to Quaylen.
So on the next page, what exactly is unconscious bias? When does it happen? And how can we be more aware of it so that we can catch it while it's happening to us? The definition of unconscious bias is when our brain is doing shortcuts. It's noticing patterns and taking shortcuts in drawing conclusions. So what happens is that at any given moment, your brain is exposed to large amounts of information and data. They've calculated it, and by some measures, it's about 11 million bits of information at any given time. But your brain can only functionally recognize 50 bits of information, and you can only process around 7 and really actually remember them. So if I put you in a new environment, in a new room, and said, can you remember your environment? You remember about 7 or so different things that you would have consciously internalized. And so at any given time, because there's so much information flowing in, your brain will notice shortcuts. They recognize the pattern, and then your brain, as a part of its essential function, will draw these conclusions almost automatically and frankly instinctively. The patterns come from things you've been taught, things you've experienced yourself, but sometimes those patterns and shortcuts can lead us to the wrong conclusions, and they can have deeply unintended consequences. So a few examples on this page of when that happens, especially as it relates to people interactions. There were anonymized auditions done a number of years ago in orchestras across the United States. So if you took the top 5 ranked orchestras in the US, they started a couple of decades ago with only about 6% women. Literally 1 out of 20 people playing in the orchestra were women. And so they started to anonymize the auditions First, they asked people to perform behind a screen. Then it was a curtain. Then they actually put carpet on the floor so that you couldn't hear high heels walking across the stage. Then they actually literally asked people to take off their shoes so that you couldn't even hear the echo of these shoes walking across the stage. And when they did this, they realized that women and men play much more equally, and the percentage of women in the top orchestras quadrupled, about tripled or quadrupled to about 21% from 6% a number of years earlier. We've also seen this happen on resumes. And so if I give you all exactly identical resumes, down to the font size, the font type, the exact bullet points that I write, and all I do is I change the name at the top. So one says Jane Doe and one says John Doe, or some, example male and female name. And both men and women will ascribe better leadership and higher future potential to this imaginary resume, John Doe, right? Because we've been so socialized to think of leadership as a male quality, we're reading all of these things into these exactly identical resumes. That's John Doe versus Jane Doe. Now, should Jane Doe put on this exactly identical resume, active PTA member, or any other signal that she is an active parent, 87% less likely to get called in for an interview. Should it be John Doe versus Jamal Doe or another African-American name, that is worth 8 years of experience gap, and the Black candidate is 50% less likely to get called in for an interview. Here we have the example 4 times less likely if it's John Doe versus Muhammad Doe or another Muslim American name. We also looked at research on what is called in the industry whitewashing resumes. When you take an ethnic detail off a resume, you are sort of whitewashing it in the terminology. And when Black Asian candidates do that, they're actually called back for an interview at almost double the rate, or actually, frankly, more than double the rate. That happened with Black candidates. The same thing happened with Asian candidates. Whenever they took off the ethnic specific details on their resumes, but otherwise kept exactly identical resumes, they were called back at higher rates. So all of these things point to unconscious bias in how we filter talent, how we interact with people in the workplace. So those are just a couple of examples. On the next page, we studied different types of unconscious bias, and there's actually 4 broad families of unconscious bias that interact with each other. It's rare that you would have just one bias on its own. Usually you have 2 or 3 different ones interacting at the same time. And let me give you a couple examples of these types of bias. Over here on the top, there are pattern recognition biases, how you filter information and recognize patterns. The first is confirmation bias, and that's the fact that you are 2 times as likely to take into account information that confirms your original hypothesis than when it doesn't, right? You have an inclination to want to believe what you originally thought. Another example would be story framing or case framing. And this happens all the time in the media. How I position a story or what I emphasize really affects how you think about it. So if we're talking about a person in people reviews, and I say, this is a beautiful case of David and Goliath, or somebody really overcoming obstacles to succeed, that would really affect how you think about that individual. The second family of biases is stability biases. And this is the very natural human inclination that we don't like change. We like what's familiar. We like the stability around us. And there's 2 related biases here, status quo bias and risk aversion. Status quo is simply, I prefer to have the status quo. I prefer to have kind of what we've got going now. If you've got a strong status quo bias in your organization, you would be much less likely to hire somebody who is culturally or personality-wise, or even background and education-wise different from many other people in the group. Similarly, risk aversion would cause you to weight the potential downside of a candidate not fitting into your group much more heavily than the potential upside of what if that candidate were to unlock the next level of performance for our team. So you would keep hiring many people in the same pattern and background as you already have with stability biases. Down here on the bottom, we've got social biases and interest biases. So on social biases, we've got the affinity bias and assimilation bias. Actually, one of my favorites is groupthink bias. It's also called bandwagon bias. And this is the inclination to really jump on the bandwagon. Well, don't we all know that that person had real challenges with this type of leadership? And instead of questioning what we quote unquote all know and getting underneath the story and the rumors and asking for real evidence, you sort of jump on the bandwagon. The reverse can happen with groupthink or bandwagon bias as well. Everybody believes this isn't possible. So how could it be, right? For a long time, we all believed no human could run a sub 4-minute mile. That was just quote unquote common knowledge. And so it works in that reverse too. How do we challenge what we supposedly know? And sunflower management is my favorite named bias. I imagine the sun going across the sky and all of the sunflowers in the field tilting their head to really, face the sun. The sun in this case is the boss, or whoever hierarchically is the leader. And the sunflowers are just tilting their head. And so it's the tendency to just take whatever the boss says as the final word, right? As opposed to digging underneath and saying, well, what's the evidence? What do we know about that person? Why aren't they fitting in? Or what's the real challenge here? And then fourth and finally, interest biases around emotional attachment, fundamental attribution error, thinking that it's more likely to be somebody else's fault if something bad happens to them versus when bad things happen to you. Yeah, you would actually appropriate it more to the environment and the situation. And then finally, I'll share with this group, the illusion of objectivity bias is probably one of the most dangerous ones, because it's the very natural illusion that we, each of us, are less biased, more insightful, more caring than others. And when you think you're less prone to bias, that's the exact pitfall that we want to avoid, right? How do we not fall into that trap and be aware that all of us are biased in different ways? It's more, how do we be aware of it and make sure that it's happening less and less? So if you go to the next page, what we've talked about so far are external biases, when somebody sees you and applies that bias to you or the shortcuts in their mind, and oftentimes leads themselves to the wrong conclusions. Those are external biases. Another example was when scientists were presented with the same exact postdoc application. Imagine a whole binder full of research, reports, publications, some with a man's name, some with a woman's name, again, exactly identical applications. Almost 80% of them would have hired the man. But there's also a second category of really important biases to keep in mind, and these are internal unconscious bias. So when I internalize everything that I've been socialized and grown up in, those are a set of internal biases, the messages that I tell myself, things where I might trip myself up or be my own worst enemy internally. One example of these internal unconscious bias is we asked MBA students, or the research was done and they asked MBA students, are you equal to other students in your MBA class or are you better? 70% of the women rated themselves as equal to their peers. 70% of the men rated themselves as better. The same is true when you ask men and women, how good is your driving? Men will say they're much better than average, independent of the fact that insurers would say they would much less like to insure men versus women at the same age. So these are a set of, this is an example by gender. There are the same internal biases by race and other elements that you have to be aware of. A couple examples here on the right of how internal unconscious bias can show up. And as I've interviewed candidates over the years, sometimes women on average, like a broad distribution, of course, but women on average might say, we did this, we achieved that, our team was really fortunate, we were able to do this together, versus I did this or I did that. So women might downplay their accomplishments or describe as the same exact leadership example much more modestly. They're more likely, at least in my experience and based on some of the research, to chalk things up to luck or talent, or, a mentor of mine gave me the opportunity to do this versus I decided to take this opportunity. And they may hedge some of their objectives or goals, and they may use or as fillers or appear less confident than men describing the same experience. So a couple of examples, but both external and internal biases are very much at play here. On the next page, we also looked at microaggressions in the workplace. And microaggressions are quite broad. They can be conscious, they can be unconscious, but they're basically the small paper cuts that happen at work, right? Small things, but they add up over time. And on the left here, you have a broad range of microaggressions, from having my competence questioned, to being overlooked for opportunities, to being disrespected. So a couple examples, and then I'll talk through some of the patterns that we see by race. I had to provide more evidence of my judgment, or my judgment was questioned in my area of expertise. I might have been interrupted or spoken over, or had others either take or get credit for my ideas. In terms of being disrespected, I might have been mistaken for someone much more junior than I was, or hear demeaning remarks, or hear somebody's surprise that, oh, wow, you're so well spoken, or you're so clear, or feeling like I can't bring my whole self to work, as Sarah was describing. And what we see in terms of the pattern of when people answer, have you experienced this microaggression once or many times at work? We see that all men, here in green in this first column, all men experience microaggressions also to some degree in the workplace, but they're much less likely than women, white women in particular, to experience those microaggressions. And then there's a pretty clear pattern of Asian women are more likely than white women, typically, slightly more, and Latinas more likely than their white female peers to experience those microaggressions, but Black women most likely to experience them. Now if you look at the far right column, Black women, 2/3 of them have had their judgment questioned in their area of expertise. 1/4 of them have heard surprise at their language skills or abilities. So much higher percentages than we see elsewhere. There are a couple of racial sort of hotspots. Over half of white women have been spoken over or interrupted more regularly, and almost 2/3 of Asian women have had others take or get credit for their ideas. So I think when you see this happening, call it out, right? When you see somebody speak over somebody else in a meeting, how do you make sure that that happens less and address it, either in that moment or potentially after the fact? On the next page, beyond microaggressions, we looked at, what are the ways that you could address unconscious bias in the workplace? And there's a number of things here that are worth exploring. First, in recruiting and hiring, you can ensure that job descriptions have unbiased language, for instance. When you use verbs like dominate or penetrate, things that are more masculine in their description, just as many men will apply as when it doesn't have those verbs, but actually far fewer women will apply in those job descriptions. You can also ensure diverse slates. So in companies where we've looked at the before and the after, when you move from one diverse candidate on the slate, kind of the Rooney Rule, to 2 or more, that's when the hiring rate of the diverse candidate often triples or quadruples, because then all of a sudden it's a real discussion and a debate. So that's a much easier way. Examples, companies like Xerox said, we're going to hold all VP openings and above open until we have 1 woman and 1 woman of color on the slate, as an example. You could provide sponsorship to diverse employees. You could make sure that you are debiasing performance reviews. You could ensure managers have the skills, right? You often quit your immediate manager. And so how do we ensure that they've got the skills to foster and facilitate the right tough conversation if an awkward situation happens? And then also celebrate on the enabler side, leadership, engagement, and networks. Celebrate great examples of inclusion and expand networks. And I know we only had a short amount of time, so we're just hitting the highlights here, but I'll end with some examples of leadership behaviors you can all consider in your day-to-day work and leadership. These are small things. There's a much longer list to consider, but a few examples. Introducing yourself when you start a meeting, especially if there's people that you don't know. Sharing your gender pronouns when you introduce yourself, but also very proactively including people with very different styles. There may be introverts on the team. How do you make space for them to participate more easily, and especially in group discussions? Notice patterns around who's getting interrupted or talked over in meetings and try to equalize that. Think about across your team, who has different barriers, especially in this time of COVID, as Sarah was describing. How do we make sure that there's a more equitable way and we're helping team members more proactively? And how do we get to know each of our team members, what matters to them, and vary our social activities versus, always talking about sports or having alcohol-based events that might not be as inclusive to everybody. So just a couple of examples, but we'll turn it back over.
Great. Thank you so much to the McKinsey team, Quaylen, Sarah, Nina. Always appreciate having you in the mix. And it seems like that second, maybe to last slide, the one with microaggressions, is getting a lot of love in the chat right now. So my understanding is that deck can and perhaps will be circulated afterwards. See Quaylen nodding. Yeah, so we'll get that out, and those charts and graphs that McKinsey did some incredible work on will be included. So take a look at that. I want to keep the conversation moving, and we're going to jump to Bob Oglesby from NeoGov, who's going to be digging into some data as well. And it seems like, given the combos Bob and I have had, that the data is very similar in talking about some of the inequity we see highlighted, particularly in the hiring process. So with that, let's jump to Bob, and we'll have a quick conversation before opening up to the larger panel.
Thanks, Ace. Glad to be here today. I'm Bob Oglesby, former State of Tennessee Commissioner of General Services and current Strategic Advisor with NeoGov. For those of you who are not familiar with NeoGov, it's the leading provider of an integrated HR, payroll, and talent management solution for the public sector, serving over 2,000 individual public sector organizations. I appreciate being able to be with you today and sharing NeoGov's public sector diversity hiring data. NeoGov's been conducting this research and analyzing data on this very important topic for several years now. In the interest of setting the stage for the subsequent discussions that will follow in today's session, I'll be taking you through our research project's current findings so you can see how our process progressed over time and what the data says. For your understanding, the U.S. workforce data I will be referencing comes from the U.S. Department of Commerce's Census Bureau. The applicant and hiring data is from NeoGov's 2,000 plus state and local government customers. The public sector hiring data set used in this research comes from the records of 16 million applicants and 600,000 hires, which is the largest public sector hiring data set of its kind. So let's move to the first slide here. Let me get you oriented. On the left side of this chart, we have percentages, and on the axis across the bottom, we have 6 race categories. The first chart shows the size of the U.S. workforce broken down to each race's representative percentage. Starting with the highest point on the left of this dark blue chart and moving to the right, the chart tells us 60% of the U.S. workforce is white, 13% Black, 19% Hispanic, and so on. Well, now laid on top of that is a chart in a medium blue color representing the 16 million public sector applicants I previously referenced. What this chart is showing is the percentage each race has applied to state and local governments through NeoGov. White people applied 46% of the time, Black 28% of the time, Hispanic 18% of the time, and so on. When these two charts are looked at together, what you can see starting on the right side and working left is that Native Hawaiian, American Indian, Asian, Hispanic, Latino applicants are all applying pretty close to the same level as they are represented in the workforce. Whereas starting on the left-hand side, whites are applying at 46%, or about 25% lower than the 60% they are represented in the entire US workforce. And Blacks are applying at 28%, a rate more than twice the 13% that they are represented in the US workforce. All right, so let's look further into the public sector's Black workforce. As the previous slide illustrated, census data tells us Blacks represent 13% of the workforce, but they're applying at 28%. When we found Blacks were applying more than twice the representation of the public sector workforce, we thought that was worth looking into further, and so we continue to dig into our data to see what was going on. The next data we looked at was the comparison of the percentage applied to the percentage hired for each race or ethnicity. What caught our attention was 3 things here. Whites are hired greater than their application rate. Blacks are hired less than their application rate. And with Blacks being hired at 18%, Blacks are very represented in the public sector, given they only represent 13% of the total US workforce. So that could be considered good news. But we still didn't know why Blacks are being hired at 18% versus their 28% applicant level. So we decided to look into that further as well to see if we can better understand where and why this drop-off was occurring. The next slides will illustrate what we found. Let's start with a look at all job types where the hiring percentage is greater than the application percentage. What does that mean? It means hiring an ethnicity for a job type at a higher rate than their application level. Here's an example. One ethnicity's applications come in at about 46%, but they're hired at 57%. Sound familiar? Yep, that's whites as shown on our previous slide. Here's what the data says. Again, we categorize all public sector jobs into the 22 job types listed down the left-hand side in the far left column. Then we analyzed our hiring data according to each of these job types and identified whenever the average percentage hired for any ethnicity was greater than their average percentage application rate, like those listed in the four next columns. What this slide shows is in every job type the public sector offers, white people are hired at a greater rate than their application rate. Another way to look at this is there's no job type where white people are not hired at a greater rate than their average application rate in our system. So to make sure this point is clear, let's flip the point of view now to look at the job types where an ethnicity's hiring percentage is less than the application percentage. Again, an example of that would be this. Applications came in at 28%, but they're being hired at 18%. Sound familiar? Yep, Blacks, as mentioned on that earlier slide. What our data says is just what you would expect. Across all job types, Black people are hired less than their average application percentage. So just to reiterate this point one more time, when we analyzed all our data from across the nation comparing the average application percentage to hiring percentage across all 22 job categories, white people were always hired 100% of the time above their application rate level. And Black people were always hired 100% of the time below their average application rate level. Once we understood this, we decided we needed to understand why this drop-off was, where this drop-off was occurring during the hiring process. So let's start with Black versus white applicants. And we're going to look at that during the 5 stages of the hiring process listed across the bottom of this slide. Assume for a moment that 100% of all Black candidates and white candidates apply for a job. In comparison to white candidates, Blacks are 12% less likely to be determined eligible. For those Blacks and whites on the eligible list, Black candidates are 2% more likely to be placed on the referred list. Now here's the real issue. Of all those qualified candidates now on the referred list, Blacks are 32% less likely to actually get an interview. 32% less likely to actually get an interview. And of those that do get an interview, they are 19% less likely to be hired. Overall, qualified Black candidates are 43% less likely to be hired than qualified white candidates. Okay, let's look at male versus female applicants. Again, assume for a moment that 100% of all male applicants and female applicants apply for a job. All candidates apply for a job. In comparison to male candidates, females are 3% more likely to be determined eligible and 1% less likely to be placed on the referred list. But once again, here's the bigger issue. Of all those on the referred list, females are 13% less likely to be asked to interview. And of those that do get an interview, they are 15% less likely to be hired. Overall, qualified female candidates on the referred list are 27% less likely to be hired than qualified male candidates. All right, so the last comparison I'm going to share with you is Black female versus white male candidates. Understand the challenge of getting hired if you're a Black female in comparison to a white male. Here are those data points. If you're a Black female, you are 11% less likely to be determined eligible. When recruiters personally review their eligible candidates, Black females actually are 2% more likely to be referred. Now comes the interview stage. If you're a Black female compared to a white male, you are 39% less likely to be interviewed once you are referred. And for those that actually get an interview, you're 31% less likely to be hired than a white male. So after analyzing 16 million applications and 600,000 hires, the big takeaway for a Black female interested in working in the public sector is this. Even if you are determined to be qualified, you are 58% less likely to be hired than a white male. Now let's look at the same analysis a little differently by comparing the number of Black female candidates to white male candidates as they flow through the public sector's typical hiring process funnel. Let's start with the data for our white male candidates. 3.2 million applied, 1.5 million were determined eligible, 1.4 million were referred, down to 290,000 getting interviewed, and 180,000 white male applicants end up being hired. That's a 5.6% of all white male applicants are hired. Now let's compare that to the Black female candidates. We had 3 million apply, almost the same number as white males. 1.2 million determined eligible, so it's dropped in some already. 1.1 million referred, it's dropped even more. 180,000 interviewed, there's a big drop, and 62,000 hired. That is a 2% ratio. So if you're a Black female, you're more than 2.5 times less likely to be hired in the public sector than if you're a white male. Just a little bit more data for your organization for you to consider. Our data says there are 2 ways organizations might be able to reduce the drop-off for Black females wanting to get a job in the public sector. Here are those 2 opportunities. PI blinding, you heard McKinsey talk about some of this. Remember, PII stands for personally identifiable information. So PII blinding, for the purpose of this discussion, means hiding candidate information that might create inequalities in the hiring process. Common examples, as previously discussed, are the candidate's name, race, school, home address, what shoes they wear, as we heard. Customers of ours who have turned this functionality on in our system have seen the number of Black females being interviewed increase 29% to those who haven't turned it on. Another way our data illustrates organizations might be able to reduce Black female candidate drop-off during the hiring process is interview rubric scoring. Our data says Black females are 21% more likely to be hired if their interview was scored. So I know that was a lot of data for you that I just went over, and I hope it's given you plenty to think about. For those of you who want to look at the data some more, we expect to publicly release this report in the next few weeks, and once we do, you can find it on the NeoGov website. Before I let you go, I want to thank the others involved in this program today for their leadership in discussing this very important and sensitive topic, as well as those of you in our audience for your interest in learning about these public sector hiring challenges and opportunities for candidates of diversity. Thank you.
So Bob, before I let you go, I had 2 questions. You've answered one of them. This report is coming out shortly, imminently, is what I understand. Is that right?
Yep. It's I'm just waiting for marketing to say it's good to go. The data we can share the data of the slide deck with you though now.
Great. Well, of course, we're waiting for marketing. That's how that goes. My second question, before we get into the panel, because I think the data you just shared, along with the conversation that McKinsey teed up for us, segues us nicely into the larger convo about what we do with that. But I was really interested as I talked to you and Shane, the CEO of NeoGov, one of the comments on why this data, why you ended up pulling this. And I think that's an important piece as we talk about intentionality. If I remember correctly and lend some context to this, Shane and the crew at NeoGov were all looking at hiring data and started to notice the stark inequity highlighted in the data. And so my recollection is you and Shane and a couple others had a conversation and told the team to go dig more, go find out what's going on, and start to look really candidly at the data. And that is what we're seeing now. This report that you just shared is the result of that exploration, but it kind of started with oh wow, didn't realize it was this bad. Can we start to put some framing around perhaps what's happening, and then we can move forward and do something about it? Is that how that came about?
Yeah, it really was. And, in the bigger context, it was about just the talent gap and the competition with the private sector for talent. And what
Yeah.
are we doing about it? And what can we do to help our customers and the public sector at large understand what these issues are and address those? So yes, it was about just getting more applicants and then really understanding that candidates of diversity really have an even bigger challenge to get hired in the public sector.
Great. And if I recall, I jotted a note. Troy asked a question about public versus private, and I think there was a slide in the presentation you just wrapped up, Bob, that started looking at the entire U.S. workforce, and then the public sector kind of overlaid. And so I think that at least half answers a question, and I'm sure we'll unpack that more as we get into panel. So Bob, thank you again for taking time to share the data with us. Again, a solid foundation for the convo. And I will turn back over to Pam to get us kicked off into what should be a robust and lively panel conversation.
Hey, Ace, let me add one more thing. We did also interview 2,700 candidates with oral interviews. And what we found out was they said that the public sector is less of a challenge to get a job than the private sector. So that's a good note for us as we see our numbers are well represented. They can be better, of course, but the private sector has a bigger issue apparently than the public sector in this regard.
Okay, all right. So we got some thinking to do around that. Pam?
Thanks, Bob, Sarah, and Quaylen for a great foundation. And I'm really excited to now hear from our state panelists as well to really build this both national approach down to our state level and what our state teams are dealing with on a daily basis. So let's make sure we bring in Dr. D'Angela Burns-Wallace from Kansas and Rebecca Roussel from Illinois. And Rebecca, I really want to start out with you because we kind of started this conversation earlier today around implicit bias. And I know that this is an area that you work on quite a bit in the state and nationally as well. How does this concept of implicit or unconscious bias impact what we've heard today? And really, how does that help us as we're going into our state planning?
Thanks, Pam. And I will say thank you to Bob and to Sarah and Quaylen for the information. I love research, so definitely going to take a little bit a better look at that once today is over. But I think when you look at the unconscious implicit bias part of that, it really shows in the numbers. These hires that we see in the lag or the lack of, or the disparity there, it's based on that particular bias that is innate. And to be very transparent, everyone does have a bias. It doesn't necessarily make you any type of feminist or racist or anything like that. However, if those biases are not checked, that's where the implicit bias comes in. And that's where you have the opportunity that it is done intentionally and it can really happen to actually be presented negatively. I think like everyone has said, I think, really analyzing that data to take a really intentional look at where we are. Are you hiring the same type of people? Are you hiring the same people that went to the same school? Are you hiring in the same type of location? Are you really hiring people? Are you really stripping that bias away and really looking at this person specifically for the experience that they bring to the table, and not looking at that person because their name is Latoya versus Samantha, or if they went to an historically Black college versus an Ivy League college. Those are the types of things that really, I think, are impactful when you start to start having the conversation about bias. And I'll say one other thing, because I know there are other people that definitely have some amazing thoughts on this. I think it's just as simple when we talk about unconscious and implicit bias, especially now in the time period that we are in. This has been going on. A lot of systems, particularly public sector systems, are really trying to unpack some systemic issues that have happened in prior. And so I think the simple thing is open your mind to being different. Open your mind to being different and open your mind to a difference of thought. Particularly from a diversity standpoint, US population census totals tells us that across this US, diverse groups are continuing to grow and the general population is declining. So this is going to be something that's not going away. And that's why I think it's important that we, again, just really start with that dialogue internally in our teams, do that self-reflection piece of this, and to really be open to thinking different things and to really approaching things differently.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. I think, those comments track to part of what McKinsey shared, understanding the starting point, be it in our organizations or personally. I know as we were having a couple prep calls, we talked about the Harvard Implicit Association test. Part of mitigating bias is understanding our biases. And as we talked about microaggressions and some of the other pieces that pop up and start to show where our biases lie, the only way we can start to stop those things is to understand the starting point, which I think was aptly said again in the McKinsey presentation. And so, Rebecca, you just highlighted some of those pieces. We've got to take a hard internal look, and there's no value judgment on where we're starting as long as we're committed to doing, as we refer to in the DEI world, the long work. So I appreciate that framing so very, very much. With that, we'll jump into a conversation. I want to pull Dr. D'Angela Burns-Wallace into the mix as well. And I see a half smile on her face as we get started. She's ready to rock. I see Elisa clapping. We've got folks who are just stoked for the combo. As we're talking about building efficient state strategy on DEI, the question is, we've looked at data, what do now, right? Where do we start and what do we start with? And that's a tough thing to grapple with. So I want to invite Rebecca and D'Angela in to start chatting about, we've seen the inequity highlighted. I know probably not wildly surprising, no jaws on the floor per se. Where do we start? And I want to kind of kick off with that open-ended question. Where do we start? Is it thinking about bias? Is it looking at where our hiring data stands today for our individual states? What's the first step in your estimation? And I'll go to D'Angela for this one to get us rolling.
So good morning. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this conversation. And thank you to the presenters for just setting an amazing groundwork for this conversation. It really is important to frame and understanding where we're starting from. And like Rebecca, I love data because that helps to take a little bit of the anecdotalness out of it, or the perceptions of, well, some people think this, or we believe this is happening. And with two different groups looking at this bout of data in two different ways, you can see how it all comes together, right? And it is telling the same story. So, as I am Secretary of Administration here in the state of Kansas, and so as we sit around this table and sit in our roles that are helping to lead our states, right, that are responsible for our offices of personnel, our hiring practices, and you see data like this, I saw a question pop up to say, does anybody have this broken out by state? Because that's your immediate first question. You're like, how bad do we look, right? But that is a good starting point. You have to understand where you are, because when we start to talk about DEI work, that diversity, creating that inclusive environment, you got to start by understanding where your environment is. And that is on multiple levels. I'd say one, you do start with your data. Understand what your data looks like in terms of hiring, in terms of retention, promotion, pay scales, and pay inequities, right? Start with your data, but don't stop there. Also begin to look at your policies and your practices. How are there policies and practices that are inherently creating inequities unintentionally, but the way that the policies or practices are structured, that there are things in them that actually are creating inequities, right? I want to say I saw the words defined early on, diversity and inclusion are outcomes, right? Those are the things we want to reach. We want a diverse workforce, we want a diverse environment, and we want an inclusive environment. Equity is the work that we're trying to do. We are trying to leverage into our processes, our policies, the things that we have at our disposal as an organization to be equitable in the spaces in which our employees engage. I would say the third piece of this, after we've taken apart that data, after we've looked at those policies and those practices, I think the third piece is having voice. You need to make sure that you're understanding the culture and the climate that your employees are experiencing. And so sometimes we see that phrase as a climate study, right? Or a satisfaction study, right? How safe are your environments? How comfortable are your environments? Is this a place I want to work? Do I believe in the mission of my state and of my agency? And do I believe that my agency believes in me in being able to support that mission, that I'm a critical piece of that puzzle? The last thing I would say is that where we start is with leadership. If there is not commitment at the top to saying that these things are a priority, everything else underneath it is for naught. I had a colleague one time, they gave an amazing presentation, and one of the things that stuck with me the most before I moved into government, this time I was in higher ed. And in higher ed, we all have these beautiful strategic plans. We love them, these 5-year strategic plans for our universities. And what my colleague said, and that I share in many places, is this: if you want to know an organization's priority, don't go get the 5-year strategic plan. Go get their budget. Where are the resources? If these are areas of commitment, what do our resources look like to be able to think about and collectively address the issues and concerns that then have been identified through our data, through our analysis? That's where I would start.
Great. So I wrote down and underscored, equity is the work. I like that. I'm going to quote it everywhere, D'Angela. So, looking at the data, looking at the culture, climate, right? Is it safe? Is it comfortable? And then, has leadership articulated a commitment to making a change? I mean, those are 3 big pieces that, for this conversation, for this group of folks tuned in, we've all got an interesting position to start shifting the work. And that starts with leadership and being really intentional about looking at the numbers. I want to jump over to Sarah from McKinsey. And, it's tough, right? D'Angela just referenced looking at culture and climate and really getting a baseline for where organizations are. How important is that acknowledgement that we aren't where we want to be in order to start doing the work? I mean, we've talked about baseline a couple times. Is it important to articulate that we are not there yet as organizations or, state governments? How important is that piece to put to words or to paper and put out there to say we've got work to do?
I mean, I think the answer is definitely important within the organization itself. I think the need for honesty, authenticity, and transparency is really important in terms of your willingness to acknowledge, what an organization needs to work on. I think in terms of the external commitments outside of the organization, Quaylen, do you want to jump in on that really quickly in terms of what we see?
Yeah, we've seen a range of external commitments. Sometimes it's public and fully public facing, and we have seen that help. By itself, it's not enough, but it could help accelerate some of the broader pressure and almost peer pressure. More often, we see organizations set an aspirational target internally. So be very bold in where we want to get over the next 2 or 3 years. And that's probably a more productive aspiration setting approach that we've seen.
Great, great, thank you. So this is the part of the conversation where I get myself in trouble for throwing questions out the window and getting into the real stuff. We've talked a lot about inclusion, right? That sense of purpose and belonging is the way that I've often defined it. We've heard comments or snippets of conversation on bringing our whole selves to work and feeling comfortable and safe. And there's this dissonance between the data and what the data might suggest, which would be blinding resumes or removing some of the ethnic details. And then there's this idea that we're supposed to bring ourselves to work. And I'm constantly struggling between if I've removed who I am in order to get the job, how do I get to show up to work now that I have the job and be my whole self? And I'm really curious. I'm really curious to dig into that. And so I don't have a specific person on the panel to go to, but I invite some knee-jerk reactions to how we grapple with the data suggesting the short-term implications of boosting our diversity in our orgs is to start blinding or removing some of the details of where we went, right? We know that if I went to Harvard versus Howard, I'm more likely to get the job. We know that. But if I remove Harvard or if I remove Howard, I'm not actually sharing who I am when I'm stepping into a role. What does that mean, and what do we do with that? I see Rebecca off mute. Are you ready to rock?
Yeah, I was ready to rock on that, Ace, because I know that has definitely been a conversation point, and there are some different views on that. But in my perspective, I think if we are talking about bringing, just even sans diversity and equity and inclusion, if we talk about bringing our authentic selves, who we are as people, to our jobs and to work with others, I think once you start to strip away and pick away those parts of me or a person that is important, then that is I feel like you're not giving me the opportunity to showcase who my entire self is, who Rebecca is. I am a proud graduate of a historically Black college and university, but I also, for graduate school, went to Roosevelt University, which is not an historically Black college, but it definitely has a diverse population, but it definitely skews higher white. But again, I don't think that I really disagree with the fact that the blinding aspect of that is the best way to go to really take a look at this particular problem. I think the better way is to really, again, look internally, do that self-reflection, and to make the effort as the organization, as that state, as that leader, to put the training in place, having that conversation. And if that particular person or that particular entity, that agency is not rising to the occasion as it relates to how the entire organization is viewing hiring and retention, then there should be other consequences that happens because of that. Because again, I just think that blinding really strips the authenticity of a person. It really does. And I like, quick story, I went to an interview previously, and the interviewer, when I came into the interview, literally told me, "I'm shocked. I didn't think you were a Black person." And I was just like, okay, what in the world? Well, here's the name. My name is Rebecca, and that essentially is not necessarily an African-American name. But the fact of the matter is, I am named for an African-American woman who is my great-grandmother. And I carry Rebecca very, very proudly because she was a strong Black woman. And then Catherine is my middle name, which isn't an African-American name. So these are the types of things, and what we mentioned, that, you know, we need to start stripping internally first before we, I think, looking at candidates starting to take away their story. Because at the end of the day, if you take away my story, then what else do I have left to give?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that
Just
is.
to jump in on that really quickly in terms of supporting that with some of the things we've seen in best practices with different organizations, because I think, Rebecca, what you just said really resonated. Rather than blinding, I think there's a couple things to break it apart. One is, where are you sourcing from and how are you doing that first screen? And I think that is where Quaylen's anecdotes around the orchestra really come to light, because I think that's where that first screen of not even giving the person the opportunity to bring their self, you know, there might be some aspects in which you don't blind, but you ensure that your screens do not screen out people from, say, alternative channels or from diverse groups. The second would be, rather than blinding, change the dynamics of how hiring discussions occur. So some of the ideas we have are, one, ensuring that, you know, whoever's taking notes or doing the interview is asking a very data-driven set of questions about the applicant and is required to support those with specific examples from the interview itself, to ensure that there's not kind of holistic, just subjective, you know, impressions about the person. The second is, which we've seen really powerful, is ensuring that the interview slate has at least 2 diverse candidates. This prevents the kind of like only situation in which it's kind of like, oh, the woman versus, you know, the men, or the one Black person in the group. And it really forces a discussion around who is the most qualified candidate. And then actively looking to new channels. So expanding beyond where you currently are looking, are some ideas in terms of changing the mechanics rather than following a totally blind hiring process.
And Ace, can I jump in right here? I think this is an important piece, because I think that one of the things that we've been working on, and I've had in other environments that I worked, and we're getting ready to launch here in our state, is a kind of a handbook or guideline for inclusive hiring practices. And that's some of the stuff that Sarah is talking about. It's this idea of thinking about, how do you make the entire practice a little bit broader, so that pipeline or that pool where you're sourcing from, you know, where you're posting positions out to, how do you use a search committee and make that search committee a bit more dynamic, that has representation across different people or different groups within your hiring, to also make sure that you're bringing in different perspectives as you are reviewing candidates, right? And these are things that there are so many different models that are out there and that are available. It's not like we have to reinvent the wheel, but I push that out there to say that, particularly for those of us who sit in these roles, you know, that are helping to lead our state, we gotta recognize that everybody is not in the same place, and that everyone doesn't know necessarily how to do this work, and not shame in this, saying you don't know how to do it, you're doing it wrong, your data is bad, but begin to pull these best practices, begin to use the work, you know, like that we've seen today and some of their recommendations, to say, how do we then put in models so that across our state and across our agency, they have a toolkit to understand how to tackle this, how to break these pieces down, and not just say there's bias in the process, our data is bad, we're not hiring the way that we want to in the most diverse environment.
That is, so if I heard you correctly, I think Kansas has just volunteered to make a handbook available to all parties involved. I see a laugh at that. No, that is the beauty of NASCA, is the reality of why we're here, right? If we can start thinking about best practices together collectively across the entirety of our country, and start to look at who's doing it really well, who's being intentional, and who's got a holistic approach to DEI, I think we put ourselves in a really good place. And so sharing information and insights and best practices as much as possible is really important. With our last couple minutes for panel before we get to some Q&A, I want to go back to one of the things that Rebecca mentioned, and it kind of speaks to the slide that we all liked from McKinsey, those microaggressions. You know, the comment of, I didn't realize you were Black, is something that, if I got the data correctly from the first presentation, Black women are 1.6 times more likely to hear demeaning remarks. If we're thinking across our organizations and looking at some of the underrepresented groups, the bias is highlighted there. But also, as we think about getting folks into the pipeline, I think one of the points Sarah made was we've got to have more than one person of color, different gender in the mix as we consider a hiring committee. As we consider bringing someone on board, we've got to interview a diverse group of candidates, not just one. And if I remember the stat correctly, something like if you only have one person of color or underrepresented minority candidate, they're 80% less likely to get hired than the others. And don't quote me on that stat, but it's close to that. The question is, how do we start to continue rather to build that pipeline? And how do we think about that holistic approach to DEI? How do we think across the spectrum of diversity, varied candidates in the hiring pipeline, and ultimately who we ask to come join our team and make them feel safe and like they're in an inclusive environment? That's a tall order, but it's an important one. Any kind of parting thoughts on how we land that plane, how we do that well, and over some period of time? It doesn't happen tomorrow, obviously, but any thoughts on how we continue that work?
I think it's important that we continue to have these conversations. I just put in the chat that we actually have 4 external employment plan advisory councils that work specifically on the 4 diverse race and ethnic groups. And we had to reach outside. And they are governor appointed. But if anyone that's listening who does not necessarily have that in structure in place, perhaps it's an opportunity to actually look at and explore looking at thought leaders in this space that can help you connect. Because, for example, Illinois is a huge state, right? We can't necessarily, my team can't necessarily get in all of the areas in the communities, but we have partnerships that we have started to align with that will help us connect with those communities. And particularly those people who are very familiar with their particular populations also know that their populations are not a monolith. So there are totally different things that have to be considered. For example, we just started our Native American Council, had their first meeting in December. I, as a person that loves to learn and learns every single day, just to really talk to our fascinating Native American council members to just really understand the crux of the things that they are just still trying to fight for from an equity standpoint, like D'Angela was talking about, and really looking at how we need to change our strategies and really need to work with them in partnership, for example, on how unique their particular community is. And so those are different things that I think is a good opportunity to reach outside of that box. I also reach across the lines. Just because it's public sector doesn't necessarily mean you might not need to have that counsel of a private sector person or a community organization. The only way that we're going to really combat this is to really put the work in. And as Ace said, it does not happen overnight. But I believe if you have a committed group of people and you also have leadership, and as D'Angela mentioned, the money to make sure that this happens, and the research as we have gotten from McKinsey and NeoGov today, that we'll start to see that progress.
I love that.
Ace, I just want to add, so 2 things. One, I think when we start to think about DEI work, where we can falter is thinking of it as something separate. It must be interwoven into the way you think about how your organization moves and who you want your organization to be. It can't be simply a separate office or a person. Having someone who has a role that helps guide and direct it is very helpful and can be key and critical as they can manage resources and make connections. But then sometimes we default and say, well, that person has the diversity stuff, so I don't have to worry about it or do it. It must be interwoven. Every action, every policy, everything that you think about, you must say, as a state, as an agency, when we do this, who is impacted and how are they impacted? And whose voice is not being heard or represented when we're implementing this policy or this practice? And are we thinking through what that looks like? Right. So the one thing that I would challenge my colleagues to remember is that it's not separate. It's not something that stands alone by itself and you figure out how to fit it in or where it's going to fit or where it's going to connect. It needs to be interwoven into how we do our work, how we create our workplaces. And then the other piece I would just say, most importantly, is that there is expertise out there. Sometimes we get into this DEI space and we want to talk about people's experiences or anecdotal, and that is good because we want voices. But I need us to recognize, just like when we need to do a salary study, we go get someone who knows how to do that professionally. They bring in the data, they assess us, they give us the recommendations, and we do the work. This work is the same. Use the experts in the field, use the data and the research in the field, and do just like we would do in any other area that we do work in to improve our organizations.
That is a beautiful sentiment to put a bow on the conversation, D'Angela. I appreciate that. I want to take a quick minute before we wrap up to see if Sarah, Quaylen, or Bob have anything to add. Those who teed the conversation up, only fitting to wrap us up as well. So any parting thoughts from NeoGov or McKinsey before we call it a day?
I think what D'Angela and Rebecca both said was totally on point. I love the point around integrating DEI into your basic processes. I think D'Angela made that point several times, including look at the budget. And it's not about, DEI being someone else's job, it's everyone's job. I think really making people from leadership to throughout the organization feel empowered and feel like they have the tools and tactics to make a change is really important. And really that education to flow through that inclusive culture and set of norms. And I loved Rebecca's example of how they're already relying on partners and other institutions in broadening their hiring scope. I think looking to other state leaders who have those really tactical suggestions about what they're doing to make a difference is really important, and continuing the discussion, as Rebecca said.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And I don't see Bob. So unless Bob, you want to add anything to the mix, I will hand it back over to Pam because we are right at time. But this has been incredible. Rebecca, D'Angela, Sarah, Quaylen, Bob, thank you for playing along. This has been insightful as always. And back to you, Pam.
Thank you, Ace. And thanks again to Sarah, Quaylen, Bob, D'Angela, and Rebecca, as well as you, Ace. We always enjoy these conversations. As we can see, not only from the chat, but just from our conversation today, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We heard some great foundation setting. We heard some great nuggets that we can take away and start those conversations in our states, but so much more work is yet to be done. So stay with us. Not only can you keep in touch through our LinkedIn group, which Jamie has dropped in the chat for you, but also through the DEI Professional Forum. We'll be getting some more information out to you about continuing this conversation in a more formal way. Also, want to let you know that our next Top 10 virtual series event will be held on March the 4th at 2 p.m. Eastern. And that is going to be around workspaces and built space optimization and reduction. It's hosted by our NASCA Strategic Partners Group. So I hope you come together. Again, look every month for not only a video podcast that you can listen to on demand, but these types of live events where you can really delve into a series of conversations between our public and private sector. So thank you so much for joining us. All of this information, the recording and the slides and resources will be in NASCA's Knowledge Center in the next few days. So thanks again, and appreciate you being with us for our Top 10 virtual series.
Thanks all.